sometimes you just want to talk about a comic because you got time to kill. And that's an apt phrase because I felt like I wanted to just talk about the first issue of the Punisher ongoing series on shelves April of 1987. So let's start with our creative team here. We got Mike Baron writing, art and color by Klaus Janson, lettered by James Novak, edited by Carl Potts. Now, before we get into the story itself, I think it's worth taking a few minutes to introduce the major players in these first two issues of the Punisher ongoing series. This opening story is basically Frank Castle following the cocaine trade backward, starting with a street-level rock house in New York and working his way up to the bigger operation in Bolivia. So this is not a huge superhero cast, it's more like a crime/action movie cast. You've got Frank, you've got a few criminals, you've got a couple Vietnam connections, and then you've got the people caught in the middle of this whole mess. So we'll start with Frank Castle. The Punisher. Frank is the engine of this whole thing. He's a Vietnam veteran, a former Marine, and a man whose family was murdered, which sent him into this one-man war on crime. But what I like about these first two issues is that the book doesn't stop everything to retell his origin. It kind of assumes you know the basics, and then it just throws you right into how Frank operates. And right away we see that Frank is methodical. He's not just walking into a room and shooting everybody because he's angry. He lets himself get mugged so he can trace the addict back to the rock house. He already has weapons stashed nearby. He has done the research. He has the warehouse. He has the war journal. He's recording information and tracking contacts, building a case in his own Punisher way. This is Frank as investigator, soldier, and executioner all at once. And to me, that's the main thing these first two issues established. He's not just a guy with guns, he's patient, he's tactical, and once he decides he's going after a criminal operation, he's going to follow it as far as it goes. And in this story, that means he starts in New York and ends up in Bolivia. Then we have Bruce Ayres. Bruce Ayres is important because he gives Frank the personal hook into this story. He's a Vietnam pilot Frank knew back in 1968, and Frank runs into him at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. That scene is important because it ties this drug story into Frank's past. This isn't just Frank reading a file and deciding to go after some random criminals. Bruce brings him information about Curtis Hoyle, another Vietnam-era figure and friend that puts Frank into this larger drug operation. When we begin this story, Bruce is actually dead, but his death matters. The official story is that he killed himself, but Frank knows enough to question that. Bruce's role is basically to open the door. He points Frank towards Hoyle, and then his death gives Frank even more reason to dig deeper. So when we talk about Bruce Ayres, I describe him as the old war connection who pulls Frank into the bigger conspiracy. He's not the star of the issue, but without him, Frank may not find this particular trail. Now, Curtis Hoyle is one of the more interesting characters in this two-parter because he's also tied to Vietnam, but in a very different way. His name is on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which should mean he died in the war. But Bruce tells Frank that Hoyle is still alive. That immediately makes him suspicious and kind of fascinating. He's a ghost from the war who has now resurfaced as part of the drug pipeline. Hoyle works as a pilot and seems to be involved with the transport side of the operation. He's the guy who helps get Frank closer to the general, and issue number 2 gives Frank the chance to confront him more directly. What works about Hoyle is that he feels like a dark mirror of Frank's military past. Frank came out of Vietnam and became the Punisher. Hoyle came out of it and became part of a criminal network. Both are men shaped by war, but they went in completely different directions. And I think that gives this opening story a little more weight than if it were just Frank fights drug dealers. There's a war veteran angle running underneath it. Wilfred Sobel is the first major criminal Frank works his way toward. He's connected to the Rock House operation in New York, and Frank identifies him as the owner of that operation. Sobel is not the top of the food chain, but he's high enough up that getting to him gives Frank the next set of contacts. Sobel comes across like a sleazy organized crime type. He's connected, he's comfortable, he's got his club, his apartment, his people around him. He thinks he's insulated, but he's also exactly the kind of guy Frank is built to tear through. His big role in the story is that he's a stepping stone. Frank uses him to get higher up the ladder. He gets names, numbers, and access. Sobel is important less because he's a great villain, and more because he shows us how Frank dismantles an operation piece by piece. Belinda Foster is Sobel's girlfriend, or at least his main woman in this story. She's not one of the main villains, but she's important because Frank uses her as part of his escape after taking down Sobel. She's one of those characters who exists around the criminal world rather than necessarily driving it herself. What stands out is that Frank sends her away to Sweden afterward. That's a very Frank Castle kind of moment. He's ruthless with the criminals, but he's not just randomly hurting everyone in the orbit of the bad guys. If someone is useful or if someone is not his target, he handles them differently. So Belinda gives us a little glimpse at Frank's code. It's still a brutal code, but it's a code. Hector Gomez is Sobel's enforcer. He's one of the muscle guys in issue number 1. His role is pretty straightforward. He represents the street-level violence protecting Sobel's operation. He's not there to be a deeply developed character. He's there to show that Sobel has dangerous people around him and Frank has to work his way through them. Guys like Sobel make money off the drug trade, but guys like Hector are the ones enforcing it. Damasco is another one of the criminals in Sobel's circle, and he's important because he helps expose Frank's infiltration. Frank is operating under the name of Bill Messina, trying to work his way into the organization. Damasco is one of the people who starts testing that cover. He's part of the reason Frank ends up captured and tortured. So Damasco matters because he shows that Frank's plan is dangerous. He can bluff, he can scheme, he can put on the tuxedo and play the part, but these people are not complete idiots. There's always a chance his cover is going to fall apart, and when it does, Frank has to survive the hard way. In Bolivia, Frank meets Senor Valencia. He shows up in issue 2 and is basically the innocent man in the middle of this Bolivia operation. He is a DEA agent who has been captured and tortured by General Tran. When Frank is told to prove himself by killing Valencia, Frank instead shoots Fernando and rescues Valencia. That moment tells you a lot about Frank. He's willing to pretend to be a criminal to get close to the operation, but there is a line. He's not going to execute an innocent man to maintain cover. So Valencia becomes the test of Frank's mission. He's also there to show just how ugly Tran's operation is. This isn't just a business, it's torture, murder, corruption, and military-style control. Fernando is one of Tran's men, and he's the one torturing Valencia. Again, not a deeply developed character, but he has a very specific function. He's there to demonstrate the cruelty of the Bolivia side of the operation, and he becomes the guy Frank kills instead of Valencia. I'd describe Fernando as the torturer, the immediate face of Tran's brutality, and the guy Frank uses to flip the situation. The big bad of these first 2 issues is General Tran. He is the man behind the larger drug operation, and he's another character with Vietnam connections. Frank had believed Tran had been assassinated in 1973, but it turns out he faked his death and became part of this international cocaine operation. Tran is important because he gives the story its sense of scale. We start with a rock house in New York, but by issue number 2, Frank is dealing with a military-style compound, armed men, aircraft, torture, and a major drug operation overseas. He's not just some local dealer, he's the source, or at least he is presented as the source Frank can reach in this particular story. And I think Tran works as a first major villain for this ongoing series because he connects Frank's war on crime with Frank's actual war history. This is crime, but it's also Vietnam coming back again in another form, and Hoyle and Tran both feel like pieces of Frank's past resurfacing in the present. I'd also mention the Rock House operation almost like it's a character itself. It's kind of where we start out in issue number 1, and this is the criminal network Frank is attacking. It starts with the crack house in New York, then moves to Sobel, then Hoyle, then Tran. The structure of these first 2 issues is basically Frank climbing the ladder. Frank doesn't just walk into Bolivia randomly. He follows the chain. Street level drugs lead to organized crime leads to transport leads to the international supplier. These opening chapters give us Frank Castle as a planner, a hunter, and a soldier still haunted by the world he came out of. Bruce Ayres pulls him into the case. Curtis Hoyle and General Tran connect the drug trade back to Vietnam. Sobel, Gomez, Damasco, and Fernando represent the different layers of the criminal machine. Belinda Foster gives us a small glimpse at how Frank treats someone who is near the crime, but not necessarily his target. And Senor Valencia gives Frank a moral test once he reaches Bolivia. It's a pretty lean cast, but it does what it needs to do. Everybody here either moves Frank up the ladder, shows us the scope of the drug operation, or reflects something about Frank himself. And for the first 2 issues of an ongoing Punisher series, that's a pretty solid way to start. Take Frank from the streets of New York, send him into the heart of the operation, and show the reader exactly how far he's willing to go. Let's get into the story. Again, the title of this story is called Marching Powder, released April 7th of 1987. So in this opening issue of the Punisher ongoing series, Frank Castle wages a one-man war against New York's drug trade, targeting a network built on crack cocaine and fortified rock houses. After stalking and taking down a street-level addict to gather intel, Castle escalates quickly, blasting his way into a heavily defended drug den with military-grade weaponry and dismantling the operation with ruthless efficiency. From the wreckage, he extracts information that points him further up the chain, revealing a larger distribution system tied to powerful players. Along the way, the story grounds his mission in something deeper, briefly connecting his present crusade to his past at the Vietnam Memorial, where he encounters Bruce Ayres, an old acquaintance now entangled in the very world Castle was attempting to tear apart. Shifting tactics, Castle goes undercover as Bill Messina, infiltrating a higher level of the organization by manipulating paranoia and ambition among its leaders. His cover earns him a seat at the table, but suspicion quickly leads to capture and torture. Even restrained, Castle turns the tables in explosive fashion, breaking free and brutally dismantling his captors from the inside. He eliminates the key figure Williford Sobel, spares a surviving witness, Belinda, with a warning to disappear, and uses the chaos to position himself as a potential replacement in the eyes of the mysterious general running the operation. By the issue's end, Castle has forced his way deeper into the criminal hierarchy, setting up a direct confrontation. The final beat pulls the threads together and hints at something deeper. After Frank calls the general, Castle reflects on the voice on the other end. Something about it feels familiar. That suspicion lingers as Curtis Hoyle appears, now clearly moving with purpose and hinting that Castle's interference has forced their hand with a plan already in motion to deal with him. The issue closes by tightening the web. Castle is drawing closer to the top, but the enemy may be closer and more personal than he realizes. The plot of issue 2. This drops Frank Castle into the heart of a Bolivian jungle stronghold under the guise of joining an old Vietnam acquaintance, Curtis Hoyle, only to reveal it as a calculated infiltration of a drug empire by the supposedly dead General Tran. Forced to prove his loyalty by executing a captive, Frank instead turns on Tran's men, sparking an all-out war across the compound. And this captive, by the way, was a DEA agent by the name of Valencia. Teaming briefly with the doomed Valencia, Frank arms himself, embraces the Punisher identity by painting his skull emblem onto his body armor, and wages a one-man assault, blowing up drug labs, commandeering an Apache helicopter, and annihilating Tran's operation piece by piece. After a brutal final confrontation where Tran's past sins resurface and mercy is denied, Frank kills him and destroys the entire base, completing his mission at immense cost. The issue closes on a somber note at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, where Frank reflects on the lingering scars of war, the loss of Ayres, and the moral toll of his crusade, hinting that while one war may be over, another still rages within him. To start things out, let's start with the cover. This opening issue of the Punisher, you basically got the Punisher hanging on a fire escape with a rocket launcher, aiming to shoot inside of this building, this crack house, rock house as they call it. Got the big title at the top, #1, first issue of an unlimited series, and you also have that weird Klaus Janson skull. It's just different. Usually the bars on the side of the teeth that come down off the skull, I don't know what you'd call this, cheekbones, but they point up instead of down, which is definitely strange. It's Slightly off, but it's memorable. The cover's pretty ridiculous, in the best way, though. It's subtle. It's not grounded, though. It's Frank Castle about to fire a rocket into the building from a fire escape. And as a kid, that's really all I needed, to be honest. When we open this thing up, we're slapped with probably some of the most, how do I say this? It was definitely of the times. There's our first encounter as a guy who stabs Frank in order to get his neck fixed because he's addicted to crack cocaine. And back in the mid to late 80s, that was huge. I mean, it's still something to be concerned about, but back then, the war on drugs, the just say no, that was something that I was aware of at 8 and 9 years old. The media portrayal of this, you couldn't escape it. Crime, danger, societal collapse, it all surrounded the epidemic of crack cocaine. And this comic, right out the gate, kind of taps into that fear. There is something to be said about Frank's code in this book. He definitely says in here that he will not pull the trigger in cold blood. So we're doing a good job of defining who Frank Castle is here if you just pick this up off the shelf. I mean, even throughout this, he spares a model who was mixed up with this big-time drug dealer. He does do a lot of interrogating first, sometimes, and he also reacts when he's threatened. So he's violent, but he's not random, okay? And I'm going to be honest with you, there's an aspect of this book that confused me, even as a reader here at 48 years old. There is a moment where this book dumps a lot of information. There's a good bit of text, and that was not something I was really liking. And sometimes it was kind of hard to keep track. There's a flashback scene which is not really labeled. You got to pay attention in order to figure out where you're at as far as the scenes that are taking place. There's just a moment where Frank flashes back to when he meets a guy at the Vietnam Memorial Wall. And there was a bit of confusion as to when that was. It was a little muddy for me. I had to go back and read it a few times, but I pieced together what was going on. I'm still not 100% sure the book makes it totally clear. I had to figure out what the payoff was for these diamond-tipped fingernails that he pastes onto himself. I couldn't figure out why he was doing this. At one point, Frank puts some diamond-tipped fingernails before he goes to meet Wilfred Sobel. And he even goes so far to scratch a mirror, so you know these things are going to hurt when he gets a hold of somebody or something. But what ends up happening, he gets tied up, and he starts getting tortured, and he uses them to cut the rope. I could never tell. Initially when I first read this, I was like, why is he doing that? I do tend to like the punchy more than the setup. I'm an action guy. This is an action book, but this is also a crime drama, so I've got to give it leeway for that. And it is a bit of an espionage story, too, with Frank doing his infiltration. But I'm here for the Punisher being the Punisher. In our final act of the book, Belinda is spared. She's sent away. I think she's sent with some money, or at least Frank sends her straight off into Sweden. Frank begins to manipulate the cocaine system that he's in right now. He's trying to make his way up the ladder. We get a mysterious figure named the General here that we don't really get much revealed. We just know that one of the characters that was thought dead initially, and Frank pieces it together that Hoyle is a bit further up the chain in this drug ring. Well, they both knew each other from Vietnam, and sure enough, that's who he runs into. And Hoyle recognizes him immediately. So, yeah, that's kind of neat writing where you're thinking that Frank is going to be portraying this guy by the name of Messina, which he does pretty well here in this first book, this first issue. But now that cover's blown as soon as Hoyle shows up. So looking back at this now, I think there's a lot going on in this issue that probably went over my head as a kid. The crime network, the Vietnam connections, who's working for who. There's a lot to keep track of. But what stuck with me then and still works now is the action. The rocket launcher, the rock house assault, the escape from the torture scene, That's the stuff that defines this book for me. Klaus Janson's art really sells that gritty tone, and even with all the violence, you can tell Frank has a code. It definitely feels more like a crime drama than a superhero comic, and while I may not be fully locked into all the plot details, the ending does a great job of pulling me forward, especially with Hoyle recognizing Frank right away. So yeah, I'm in. I want to see where this goes. So my thoughts on issue 2 and kind of like the story as a whole here as we wrap it up. This is a step up from issue 1 for sure. We go from Frank dealing with some drug dealers in the city to him flying into a jungle compound in Bolivia, going up against what is basically a small army. This is full-on escalation, and honestly, I'm okay with it. It didn't feel like too much. It felt like a natural progression into something bigger. Now, tone-wise, this issue really walks an interesting line. Because on one hand, this is absolutely over-the-top 80s style action. You've got helicopters, explosions, Frank taking on dozens of guys at once. There's a moment where he literally jumps out of a helicopter, falls through some trees, lands on his feet. Now that's pushing it a little bit. But at the same time, I feel like the book knows what it is. It's aware of how big and bombastic it's getting. It kind of reminds me of something like Rambo 3. Just that one-man army jungle warfare vibe. The difference is the comic still wants you to buy it because it's Frank Castle. It's not just some random action hero. This is a guy who plans, who prepares, who's been through war. And that's where I think the book does a good job keeping things grounded, just enough. Because underneath all that action, there is some character work going on here, especially with Frank's mindset. There's that line where he thinks this whole thing might be an elaborate suicide scheme. And I thought that was really important. That's not just throwaway dialogue. That's Frank being aware of what he's doing. He knows the kind of situations he's putting himself into, and he knows how this could end. And then you get to the end where he says, "I'm sick of the war. I quit." Now, do I buy that? No, not for a second. This is issue number 2 of an ongoing Punisher series. We all know he's not hanging it up this early. But I do buy it in the moment, because this is the guy who's been through Vietnam, lost his family, and is now throwing himself into another war, whether he wants to call it that or not. So yeah, I believe that he's tired. I believe that for a moment, he thinks he's done, but it just doesn't last. And that kind of ties into the Vietnam angle that runs through this story. I don't necessarily think the book is saying that the war never ended for Frank. Not in a literal sense, but what it does show is that Frank understands what war does to people. You see it through Ayres, who couldn't handle it. You see it through Hoyle, who went down a different path. You see it through General Tran, who took his experience and built this entire operation. Frank's seen what the war does. He's seen how it breaks people, how it changes them. And even if the book doesn't fully dive into how it's affected him internally, you can tell that it's there in the background. Now, speaking of General Tran, he's fine as a villain. He serves his purpose. There's a shared history between him and Frank, and you could have probably done more with it. Maybe built him up into more of a mirror to Frank. But honestly, I don't think that was the goal here. This wasn't about creating a long-term villain. This was about the mission. Frank infiltrating, taking everything down, and getting out. And for that purpose, Tran works. Same goes for Valencia. You kind of know from the jump, this guy isn't making it out of this issue. He's a temporary ally. But what he does add is a bit of contrast. Here's a guy, I think he said he was DEA, I believe. He's trying to do the right thing, trying to take down Tran, and he doesn't survive it. Frank does. And that's kind of the difference, isn't it? Frank operates in a way where he's willing to go further, do more cross lines that other people won't. And that's why he walks away when some others don't. Now, one thing that I really liked in this issue is how it handles Frank in terms of control versus chaos. Because on one hand, he does plan. Like he's stashing weapons in the jungle, thinking ahead, setting himself up for escape routes. He's not just running into things blind here. But once things do go sideways, and of course they always do, it becomes less about the plan and more about whether he's ready to act in the moment. And that's kind of what defines him here. He's not just a tactician, he's a guy who prepares as much as he can and then survives whatever chaos comes his way. So if I had to sum up issue number 2 in one sentence, I'd say this. This is an action movie with just enough character work to keep it grounded. It's big, it's loud, it's over the top, but it never completely loses sight of who Frank Castle is. There's still that mindset, that weariness, that understanding of what all this violence actually costs. And for issue 2 and of an ongoing series, pretty solid in my opinion.